Ready for a deep dive. Today, we're tackling biology. You know, that thing that makes a redwood forest totally different from, say, a desert.
Life itself.
Exactly. We're using selections from Introduction to Biology, that's our what's, and The Nature of Science, our how, to figure out what makes life tick. You definitely don't need a lab coat to follow along.
It's true. We're going behind the scenes, not just giving you the facts, but showing you how we actually figure them out.
And I have to say, this picture of a redwood forest in Introduction to Biology just blew me away. This is what we're talking about, life just exploding everywhere.
It's awe-inspiring, isn't it? That feeling is what drives biologists. We're not just memorizing names and dates. It's about asking those huge, how does this even work, questions. Like, how do these trees get so massive? What's going on inside every single leaf?
And wouldn't you know it, the very next slide hits us with those questions. It's like they were reading our minds. What is biology? Why study it? And how does it all connect?
Because biology is all about connections. The more you learn, the more you see how interconnected everything is. That's why we have to split it into different fields. There's just too much to explore.
Like trying to understand a whole city, right? You've got your architects, your plumbers, your electricians,
Yeah.
each one with their own expertise, but all contributing to the big picture. Speaking of which, we've got this slide with a whole bunch of biological fields: microbiology, genetics, ecology, oh, and even demography, which I wasn't expecting.
And they all play a part. Genetics helps us understand inheritance, which then explains how species adapt to their environments, which is what ecology is all about. And demography, it takes those biological principles and applies them to human populations, how we grow, change, all that.
Whoa, it really is all connected. But something's been on my mind. Slide 4 has this super close-up of cells, and it got me thinking, what even makes something living? How is a butterfly any different from, say, a rock?
The million-dollar question. Luckily, slide 4 lays out 6 key characteristics of living things. First up, organization. Living things are structured from their molecules on up. And then there's energy use. They need fuel to grow, to do their thing.
So even something like a tiny seed is using energy to sprout, even though we can't see it happening.
Absolutely. And then you've got growth and development, the ability to reproduce and pass on those instructions for life, responding to the environment, and adapting to it over time. It's like built-in survival mechanisms.
Those characteristics seem so simple, but they're like the rule book for all life on Earth. But how do we even begin to study something so complex, so massive, so alive? Where do we even start?
That's where the nature of science comes in. Slide 1 introduces us to the scientific method. It's not about magically having all the answers, but having a system to ask the right questions.
It's like a detective's toolkit for the universe. And I love that magnifying glass on slide 2. It's like science helps us zoom in on the details we'd otherwise miss. So what tools are we talking about here?
Well, slide 2 tells us that science is about studying the natural world in a systematic way. We're talking observation, experimentation, constantly asking why. It's not about being right or wrong, but getting closer to understanding.
So walk us through this scientific method. What are the steps?
Okay, imagine this. You notice something interesting, something that piques your curiosity. That's your observation. Then you ask a question about it. Based on what you already know, you form a hypothesis, a testable explanation for what you observed.
It's that classic aha moment, like we see on slide 3 with the light bulb.
Exactly. But that's just the first step. You use that hypothesis to make predictions and then design an experiment to test them. Then you analyze the result to see if they support your initial idea, and here's the important part.
Let me guess. It's a cycle. You learn from the results, even if your hypothesis was wrong, and then try again.
You got it. The scientific method is about constantly refining our understanding with each experiment, building on what we've learned, getting closer and closer to the truth. It's a journey of discovery that never really ends.
It really is a journey, isn't it? Always learning, always refining. But let's go back to the hypothesis for a sec. Slide 5, there's that light bulb again, that aha moment. But what makes a good hypothesis in the first place?
Well, it's got to be testable, right? You need a way to actually see if it holds up. And falsifiable, meaning there has to be a chance your experiment could prove it wrong. Otherwise, it's not really science, just an idea.
So you're looking for a way to potentially disprove your own theory? That's interesting.
Exactly. You got to be open to being wrong. A good hypothesis comes from what you know right now, but it has to be open to change as you learn more.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's talk experiments. Slide 6 shows all these colorful flasks, like something out of a mad scientist's lab. What are those about?
Those are our variables. the ingredients that make an experiment work, so to speak. You've got your independent variable, that's what you're changing deliberately. Then there's the dependent variable, the thing you're watching to see if it changes because of that change you made. And then everything else, everything you keep the same, those are your control variables.
Okay, so it's like, baking a cake. You change the type of flour, that's your independent variable, but you keep the oven temperature the same controlled variable, and then you see how the cake turns out, your dependent variable.
Perfect example. You're isolating the cause and effect, figuring out what's really going on.
This is making me hungry. But it also reminds me of something else on slide 7. Scientific bias. We've got this image of old-fashioned balance scales, which seems appropriate. How do scientists make sure their own expectations don't, tip the scales and mess up their experiments?
Ah, that is the question, isn't it? Because we all have biases, even if we don't realize it. We might pay more attention to evidence that supports what we want to be true, or interpret results in a way that fix our existing ideas, even if
It's not really what the data's saying, like, scientists are human, they can cherry pick too.
it can happen. That's why being aware of it is so important. Scientists have ways to try and minimize bias, like using blind studies where they don't even know which group is getting what treatment until after they've analyzed the data.
That's clever. Like a blind taste test to keep things honest. Okay, moving on. Slides 8 and 9 have me thinking about science on a global scale. Do scientists around the world all use the same, language when they're measuring things?
They do. That's where the International System of Units comes in, or SI for short. It's the metric system based on multiples of 10, so it makes conversions a lot easier.
Right, meters, liters, grams. Vaguely remember those from school.
Exactly. The SI system has 7 base units for things like length, mass, time, temperature. All the other units are derived from those.
But wait, doesn't the U.S. use a different system?
We do tend to use the customary system here, your inches, pounds, gallons. It's on slide 10. It can get a little tricky when you're comparing data from different countries, so understanding both systems is helpful.
It's like being bilingual, but for science. Okay, so we've got our global language, our trusty scientific method, we're keeping our biases in check. But what about sharing all these amazing discoveries? Slides 11 and 12 seem to be all about the paper trail of science.
And it's a very important paper trail. Scientists will usually document their work in formal lab reports. It's a structured way to present the research, what they did, why they did it, what they found.
So it's like a recipe other scientists can follow to try and replicate the experiment.
Exactly. Slide 11 breaks down the main parts, the introduction, setting up the research question, materials and methods, that's like your ingredients listed in instructions. Then the results, where you present the data. And finally, the discussion, where you interpret those findings and draw your conclusions.
So it's not just about the data itself, but figuring out what it all means.
Yeah.
What about slide 12, though? Citing sources. Why is that so important?
Citing your sources is crucial for scientific integrity. It gives credit to those researchers who did the groundwork before, prevents plagiarism, of course, and it also lets others verify the information, trace it back to the source, building on existing knowledge, but ethically and transparently.
It's like giving credit where it's due, but also creating this web of connected knowledge. And speaking of connection, slide 13 shows a magnifying glass on a scientific paper, which makes me think of peer review. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Peer review is like quality control for science. Before a study gets published in a reputable journal, it has to be evaluated by other experts in that same field. They scrutinize the methodology, the data analysis, the conclusions, everything, to make sure it's up to snuff, scientifically speaking.
So like a team of expert fact checkers.
Exactly. Peer review helps to filter out unreliable studies, improves the overall quality of published research, and helps prevent the spread of misinformation. It's a vital safeguard for scientific knowledge.
It's like a stamp of approval from the scientific community. Yep, this research is solid.
Precisely. It's all part of this collaborative process, building on each other's work to advance our understanding.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. But before we get too lost in lab reports and peer reviews, let's bring it back to our listeners. Slide 14 of The Nature of Science hits us with a pretty big question. So, what does this all mean for you?
Now, that is a question I'd love for everyone to think about. We've explored the scientific method and how it all works, but how can we apply these principles outside of a lab setting in our everyday lives?
That's what I'm wondering. It seems like the scientific thinking, the way of asking questions and testing things out, it could be so helpful in just navigating life in general.
Absolutely. We're constantly making observations, even if we don't call them that, forming hypotheses, drawing conclusions based on our experiences, whether we realize it or not.
So we've all got a little scientist inside us.
Exactly. And the more we understand how the scientific method works, the better equipped we are to make informed choices, to solve problems, to approach the world with a curious and discerning mind.
I love that. Like we're leveling up our brains.
I like that analogy
Hmm.
because it shows that learning about science isn't just about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about developing a way of thinking, a way of approaching the world that lets us ask better questions and find better answers.
It's like we've been given this incredible toolkit, but figuring out how to use it in our own lives, that's the real challenge.
That's what makes it so interesting. It's not just about, understanding the science of it all, but actually using it to make better decisions, be more informed, just appreciate the world around us on a whole other level.
So what would be an example of that? How could someone use, say, the scientific method in their everyday life?
Let's say you want to sleep better. You can start keeping a sleep journal, right? Jot down how many hours you're getting, when you go to bed, what you ate, how much exercise.
Like being your own sleep detective.
Exactly. That's your observation phase gathering data.
Yeah.
Then maybe you form a hypothesis, like, I think eating late at night is messing with my sleep.
Hmm.
So you change that one thing, no more midnight snacks, but keep everything else consistent. That's your experiment.
And after a week or two, you go back to your sleep journal and see if anything's changed.
Right. If it worked, awesome.
Oh.
If not, you go back, maybe tweak the hypothesis, cut back on caffeine in the afternoon, and test again. That iterative process we were talking about, always experimenting and refining.
It's like you're a scientist in your own life, always looking for ways to improve things, optimize.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it becomes more natural the more you do it. You start noticing patterns, questioning assumptions, tackling problems in a more, I guess you could say, analytical way.
It's like a brain upgrade.
Huh. I like that. Because it really is about more than just memorizing facts. It's about developing this way of thinking, this way of approaching the world that helps us ask better questions and find better answers.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into biology and the awesome power of the scientific method, I want to leave everyone with this thought. We've talked about redwood forests and cells and all these scientific discoveries, but the most amazing discoveries, they happen in our own minds. That curiosity, that drive to understand the world. Never lose that.
Because science isn't just a subject in school. It's a way of looking at the world, asking why, asking how, never stopping that search for answers.
So be curious, keep exploring, and who knows what you'll discover about the world, about yourself, about everything. Until next time, keep on diving deep, everybody.